Thomas, Percy, and the Abominable Snowman. It was winter on Sodor, and the first snowfall of the year had covered Thomas's branch line. The engines were in the shed, getting steamed up for the day. Their crews were huddled around an oil drum fire next to the steps of Thomas's cab. They were all talking about a program they watched last night about a strange creature, the Abominable Snowman, who is said to live far away, somewhere in the hills. No one was quite sure what it looked like, except it was large and white as snow. The presenter of the program had said whoever got the first photograph of the Abominable Snowman would be famous and rich. Percy looked over at Toby. "You don't suppose a thing like that exists, do you?" he asked. Toby pondered. "I don't know," he said at last. "It could do. I mean, we've all seen stranger things in our time." Thomas scoffed. "Percy, you'll believe anything. There's no such thing as the Abominable Snowman." Bruno, the sentinel engine, was about to interject, but Percy spoke first. "Oh, really?" he smirked. "This is coming from an engine who thought I was a ghost." Thomas was taken aback. I was only pretending to be scared," he retorted lamely. "I knew it was you, really." Just then his crew climbed into his cab. "Come on, Thomas," said his driver. "It's time to start work." Thomas hastily puffed away. "Thomas shouldn't really be rude to you like that," Bruno piped up. Percy chuckled. "He was only teasing," he said. "It's something we've always had a habit of doing." "Yes," added Toby. "Believe me, Bruno, once you've been around them for a while longer, you'll understand a bit better." Bruno thought for a moment, and decided to take Toby's word for it. Near the junction, the line had a gradient. It was gentle on one side, but rather steep on the other. The steep side had a set of emergency points with a siding at the foot, and in winter, a large mound of snow is shovelled behind the set of buffers. They used the snow as a double buffer zone. That morning, Percy was bringing stone to the harbour. When he arrived, he saw a long train of trucks waiting to be taken away. "These are supplies for the villages in the valley along the branch," the foreman explained. "They need to be delivered soon. We're expecting another heavy snowfall soon." Percy looked on the horizon, and sure enough, dark clouds of snow were beginning to form. Percy's driver looked doubtful. "I don't know if we could take all these at once," he said. "They do look rather heavy, and Percy might not be able to manage on his own." "Of course I can," Percy huffed. "I've handled those longer than this, and we can't let everyone else down." The driver looked sceptical, but decided it was best to avoid a dispute and agree. Soon, Percy was coupled to the trucks, and when all was ready, they set off. His driver was right. The trucks were heavy, and he had to work harder to get them moving. But at last they were away. Here we go, he puffed as they started up the gradient. Then it happened. As they started down the other side, Percy began to pick up speed. His driver applied the brake to slow them down, but Percy's train was too heavy for them to regain control. "Oh no!" Percy cried, and he slid down the gradient. Fortunately, the emergency points automatically set, and Percy slid into the siding, thumped through the buffers, and ploughed into the large bank of snow. His crew, unhurt, clambered out of the cab and walked to Percy's buried front. "Oh, you foolish engine," sighed the driver. "I told you you might not have managed on your own." "I thought I could manage it," Percy replied in a muffled voice. The fireman looked up. "Best we go and find shelter for now," he said. "The snow's starting to fall." Fortunately, there was a workman's hut nearby, so they and the god went to take shelter, leaving Percy alone. The snow fell and fell, and soon it was starting to engulf Percy. "Oh, brother!" he shivered as he disappeared under. Meanwhile, Thomas was making his way to the junction. He was making heavy work of his train, and he was still brooding over the morning's conversation. "Abominable snowman," he muttered to himself. "Puh! There's no such thing. Why, if there is, I'll—" He stopped mid-sentence. He thought he could hear a strange moaning sound through the wind. It went. Thomas rounded the bend and saw something that made him goggle in horror. A large mound of snow was staring right at him. "No!" he stammered. It can't be. It's the Abominable Snowman!" In a panic, he picked up speed and shot off like a bullet. The station master at the junction was on the platform when Thomas came screaming in. He was going so quickly he almost overshot the platform. It made the station master jump in surprise. He regained his composure and went to speak to Thomas's driver. "What on earth are you playing at?" he demanded. "You know it's dangerous to travel at this speed in this weather." "Sorry," said the driver, "but Thomas seems to have been spooked." He went round to speak to Thomas. "What's the matter with you?" he asked. "You're white as a sheet." I saw it," Thomas stammered. "Saw what?" the driver asked. But before Thomas could answer, a porter came up and whispered something to the driver. The driver was puzzled at first, but then it dawned on him, and smiled. "Come on," he said at last. "Where are we going?" Thomas asked. "Oh, nowhere," the driver smirked. "Just to go see the Abominable Snowman for ourselves." Poor Thomas was aghast. You can't be serious!" he exclaimed. "Perfectly serious," said the driver. "Now come along." Thomas trundled slowly back up the line, and soon pulled up right beside the Abominable Snowman. It stared at him, its eyes looking pained. Thomas gulped. "Now," said the driver, "where's that bucket?" "What are you doing?" asked Thomas anxiously, as the driver took some hot water from his boiler. "Oh, just giving the poor thing a hot drink. It'll catch a cold in this weather," the driver replied. He climbed up to the top of the Abominable Snowman's head, with the bucket of hot water in his hand. Then, without warning, poured the bucket over the head. The Abominable Snowman let out a muffled yell, and then some of the snow came away, revealing a familiar face. "Ow!" it spluttered. "That really hurt!" Thomas's driver looked at Thomas. "Well, there's your Abominable Snowman," he laughed. "It's Percy buried under all this snow." He then clambered down. "Really sorry about that, Percy," he apologized. Percy looked rather pained. Thomas just stood there and stared. Soon, Toby arrived with some workmen, and when Percy's crew rejoined them, they all set to work freeing Percy from his snowy prison. Once his fire was relit, he felt much better. "Thank you," he sighed. "That didn't feel rather pleasant." He then looked at Thomas. "What's wrong with you?" he asked. There was a bit of a silence. Then Thomas said slowly, You made me scared with all that moaning you were doing." "Moaning?" Percy quizzed. Don't know what you're talking about. Don't know what I'm talking about, Thomas started. But then he stopped. He couldn't think of what to say. I think, said Toby at last, I think we can all agree that the Abominable Snowman is an old cock and bull story. You can say that again, said Percy. You can certainly say that again. And with that, the 3 engines set off for home. The Fogman. Along Thomas's branch line, near the junction, the line ran double-tracked for a cutting. In winter, the engines had to take care when running through it, for they had to be careful of rock and snow that sometimes fall onto the track. Cyril, the local fogman, had a very important job. Every morning when the fog was low, he would walk down from his cottage near the cutting and attach small little discs to the rails that were the size of a bottle cap. These were fog detonators, designed to be run over by engines to warn them when fog was ahead. That morning, Thomas was approaching the cutting towards the junction. As he rounded the bend, bang! Ooh! Shivered Thomas as he ran over the detonator. That made my axles tingle. Looks like Cyril's done his job, said his driver. There's fog ahead, so we better slow down. They passed Cyril's cottage, and Thomas whistled, "Peep peep, thank you," and continued on to the junction. That night at the sheds, the Fat Controller came to see the engines, with something to show them. It was a large metal box with 4 horns, arranged in a cross mounted on top. "What is it?" asked Percy. "This is a new invention, a railway foghorn," the Fat Controller explained. "It warns you when there's fog ahead, like this," and he flicked a switch. Pop! The horns blared into the night air, so loudly that everyone jumped. That's loud," winced Percy. "Too loud," added Toby. "Sounds like a harbour tug to me," groaned Bruno. "Any louder and your eardrums will burst." Thomas was worried. "What will Cyril do now?" he asked. "He'll be getting a much-needed rest," the Fat Controller said. "Besides, this new foghorn will be more reliable." "Poor Cyril," sighed Thomas. "He's been replaced." The next day, Percy was taking some trucks to the harbour and was approaching the cutting when... Pop! "Oh, bother!" Percy winced. "That foghorn is so loud it's rattling my dome, and it doesn't even make my axles tingle." "Still, we better slow down," said his driver. "There's fog ahead." The foghorn had been so loud that it made the cutting side shake. No sooner was Percy out of sight when there was a low rumbling noise that got louder and louder, and with a rumble and a crash, an avalanche of snow and rock slid down the cutting side. Before long, the track was blocked, and the foghorn was buried. A short while later, Thomas set out from the junction with an up train. As he approached the cutting, he was suddenly enveloped in a thick blanket of fog. "Help!" cried Thomas. "I can't see a thing!" And then, before he could even think of anything else, thump! He ran straight into the fallen snow. "Bust my buffers!" Thomas spluttered. "What happened to the foghorn?" "I don't know," said his driver, getting to his feet, "but at least no one's been hurt." "Hang on," said the fireman. "Toby's due to come this way soon. And if there's no fog warning," finished Thomas, "he'll run into this too." "Leave it to me," came a voice from the fog. Thomas's eyes widened. "It's Cyril!" he cried. "I just hope he's in time." Toby was trundling down from the quarry on his way to the harbour. He was looking forward to a drink at the next station when... Bang! "Fog detonators!" exclaimed Toby as he ran over the cab. "Must be fog ahead," said his driver. "We'd better slow down." And they slowed down as they entered the cutting, his axles still tingling. They were just in time, for as they entered, they saw the snowfall, and Toby braked to a stop, just a few inches clear. "Goodness!" he gasped. "That was close." Soon help was called, and Bruno arrived bringing Terence and Percy with some workmen. They soon had the tracks clear and Thomas back onto firm rails. The Fat Controller had also heard the news and came to the scene. "If it wasn't for Cyril," said Thomas, "Toby would have had a worse accident than us." "Instead of replacing Cyril with the foghorn," said the Fat Controller, "we'll replace the foghorn with Cyril." He turned to Cyril and shook his hand. "You, sir, are clearly more reliable." "Thank you, sir," said Cyril. "And thank you," smiled Toby. "Well," said Bruno, "new inventions are all very well, but they don't make your axles tingle," finished Percy. Everyone heartily agreed. Percy and the Wolf. It was a rather quiet morning at Fogman, and Percy was waiting for Bruno to bring the first load of stone down from the quarry. While he was simmering nicely in the cold winter air, his fireman came hurrying up with the morning paper in his hand. "Have a look at this," he told the driver, handing him the paper. The driver looked at it and stared. On the front page there was a headline that said, "Rare and exotic Arctic wolf escapes from enclosure at Knapford Zoo. Keepers urge anyone to get in contact if spotted in their area." Percy looked worried. "Aren't wolves meant to be fierce?" he asked. "Well, it depends on where you encounter them," the fireman replied. "Though this one was quite a beautiful sight on my last visit to the zoo. The keeper told me she's considered one of the main attractions of the enclosure." "All the same, though," said the driver, "we'd best be careful if it's on the loose." The fireman agreed. Just then, Bruno arrived with the load of stone, and Percy told them about the escaped wolf. "I doubt it'll ever come here," Bruno replied. "Wolves are meant to be more adept at hunting for food in wooded areas, and with all the snow still around, I reckon it'll be even harder for anyone to track her down." Percy agreed, and soon he was coupled to Bruno's trucks and he was ready to head down to the harbour. The snow started to fall again as he set out. All the while, he kept thinking about the escaped wolf. "I do hope someone finds her eventually," he thought to himself as he trundled along. A while later, he was approaching the cutting near the junction. Then, looking ahead, he thought he saw something strange. "Stop!" he suddenly cried, putting on the brakes. His crew were taken completely by surprise. "Oh! Ow! What are you playing at, Percy?" his driver demanded, rubbing his nose. "Stopping like that? You'll break my nose one of these days." "There's something on the track," said Percy, as the fireman climbed down to look ahead. "What are you on about?" the driver grumbled. "All I can see ahead of us is snow." "I wouldn't be so sure about that," called the fireman. "Come and have a look at this." The driver climbed down and walked over to where the fireman was crouching on a small pile of snow. But, on closer inspection, the snow looked like fur. White fur. "Well, I'll be," the driver gasped. "It looks like we found the escaped wolf." The fireman carefully put 2 fingers against the wolf's neck. It was breathing. Just. "Looks like she's been hurt," said the fireman. "Her leg seems to be a bit swollen. Probably must have fractured it somehow." He then got to his feet and hurried down to the guard's van. "What's the problem?" asked the guard. "I need you to bring 2 planks and a big blanket," the fireman replied. The guard stared. "What on earth for?" he asked. "No time to explain," said the fireman. "Just please hurry up." So the guard hurried back inside his van and came out with the planks and blanket and followed the fireman back to Percy. He was quite taken aback when he saw the injured wolf. "Right," said the fireman. "Wrap half the blanket round the 2 planks and then we can carefully wrap her up to keep her warm." It was a rather delicate task, but eventually they got the wolf wrapped up warmly, and while the driver and guard carefully carried her back to the guard's van, the fireman walked over to the nearest line-side telephone to inform the signalman what had happened and requested the station master at the junction to contact the local vet. Soon, Percy's crew climbed back into his cab. "Right, Percy," said the driver, "we'd best take it steady till we get to the junction." Percy agreed, and soon they set off again. He finished his journey as smoothly as he could and arrived at the junction. Richard was there, waiting for some of Percy's trucks. "All right there, Percy," he asked. "Where have you been?" "Sorry, Richard," said Percy. "Something came up." Richard was confused, but before he could ask, a man in a large overcoat, carrying a large Gladstone bag, came walking onto the platform and spoke to Percy's crew. "Are you the ones who found the escaped wolf?" he asked. The fireman nodded and led him to the guard's van. The vet looked over the wolf carefully. Afterwards, he spoke to the fireman. "It's a good thing you found her as soon as you did," he said. "Any later and she would have had it. I shall take you from here and take her to the vet for treatment." The fireman thought for a minute and then went to speak to the driver and the station master. "I'll accompany the wolf to the vet," he told them. "That way I can get in contact with the zoo and let them know that she's safe." "Good idea," said the station master. "They'll most likely be worried sick about her by now." He went into his office to telephone the Fat Controller. Soon, Percy's fireman and the vet carefully carried the wolf to the vet's car, and they were soon on their way to the surgery. Richard looked at Percy. "Well, what do you know?" he smiled. "Well done, Percy." And when some of the stone trucks were marshalled into his train, Richard set off. A few days later, the Fat Controller came to the shed with the morning paper. He showed Percy the front page, which said, "Local branchline engine saves Arctic wolf. Return to rebuilt enclosure after recovery in local veterinary." The keepers have asked me on their behalf to thank you and your crew for your actions, he smiled. And I will say this, Percy, that once again you are a really useful engine. Percy was very pleased. Christmas coaching. Thomas adored the Christmas season. He was busier than ever, taking goods and passengers up and down his branch line. He loved seeing the smiling faces of the villagers. It even made the thought of wearing his snowplough more bearable. Annie and Clarabel, on the other hand, had their quandaries with the holiday season. They liked helping the townsfolk, but they were older coaches and didn't fancy the hustle and bustle. Thomas tried to keep them in good spirits, but as the days ticked on, it became quite an ordeal. One morning, close to Christmas, Clarabel felt cantankerous. "Another parcel, bag or box, and I'll burst," she wailed. "Bother your boxes," huffed Annie. "My upholstery won't last till the new year if I have any more passengers." "Oh, come on, you two," chuckled Thomas. "Christmas Day is nearly here. We can't let the passengers down now." "It's all right for you," replied Clarabel. "You've only your driver and fireman to carry. We're positively packed." All day the grievances continued. Thomas tried everything. He stayed with the coaches between runs, kept them warm with his steam, and listened intently to their complaints. Alas, nothing satisfied Annie and Clarabel, and their foul mood was rubbing off on everyone. Even the trucks grumbled about them. Thomas was glad when he was called away to shunt at the big station. When he arrived, he confided in Edward. "I just don't understand," he sighed. "They've always been a bit put out around Christmas, but this takes the cake." "They're working very hard. I'd say it's made them lose sight of what Christmas truly means," replied Edward. "I think I know how we can fix that." As dusk fell, Thomas brought his last train to the big station. Annie and Clarabel were glad to be finished for the day. Or so they thought. Thomas was uncoupled and moved away. Suddenly, Annie could see Edward and old Slow Coach backing down towards them. "I say, Edward, you must be at the wrong platform." "On the contrary," smiled old Slow Coach, "we're right where we need to be." "The vicar is hosting a dinner at the church for those less fortunate," said Edward. "We may have many volunteers and supplies to deliver, but can't do it ourselves." "That," finished Thomas, "is where you two come in." Annie and Clarabel didn't know what to think. They were exhausted, but knew it wasn't proper to complain about helping it with such a cause. Quiet and reluctant, they followed Edward out of the station. As the evening crept on, a light snow fell. Edward made several stops, picking up more volunteers and supplies at each station. It wasn't long before the train was packed, and Annie and Clarabel began to grumble. Day and night, packed tight. "There is a time and place," interrupted old Slow Coach, calmly but firmly, "to consider our own needs before others. This is not one of them."
Annie and Clarabel retired into stunned silence. When they arrived at the church, the coaches could hardly believe their eyes. Brilliant lights had been strung up, Christmas trees dotted the yard, and a large crowd had congregated outside. The volunteers spilled out of the compartments and eagerly unloaded supplies from Clarabel. Soon, the smell of food wafted from the church kitchen. The crowd worked their way inside, eager for a hearty meal. Annie and Clarabel soon heard the sound of carols and laughter. "Lovely, isn't it?" smiled old Slowcoach. "Hard work to put it all together, but it's work that matters." At the end of the night, the vicar spoke to Edward. "A most remarkable turnout," he beamed, clasping his hands together. "Bless you, Edward. Your help made this all possible." "Thank you, your reverence," said Edward, "but we couldn't have done it without Annie and Clarabel. Their assistance was invaluable." "It was the least we could do," said Clarabel. "And we'd do it again in a wheel turn. Wouldn't we, Annie?" "Indeed we would, Clarabel." "One thing you can and should do is get some rest," smiled Edward. "Come on, let's get you back to the junction." Thomas was asleep in the carriage shed when Edward brought the coaches back. He stirred as they were shunted alongside. "Well then," he yawned, "how was your extra work?" "Simply marvellous," smiled Annie. "Off to sleep with you now, Thomas," said Clarabel. "We can't let our passengers down before Christmas comes." Thomas chuckled, and the three friends fell contentedly to sleep.